Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Jerry Moorhead, President of the University of Georgia, and it is my honor to welcome you to the 2024 Getzen Lecture on Government Accountability. The Getzen Lecture is an annual lecture series presented by the School of Public and International Affairs and their Department of Public Administration and Policy. This lecture is made possible through the generosity of UGA alumni Catherine Getzen Willoughby, who graduated with a PhD in public administration in 1991, and her husband, Dan Willoughby Jr., who graduated from the UGA School of Law in 1986. The lecture series honors Catherine's parents, Forrest and the late Evangeline Getzen, both lifelong advocates of public service and education in this country. We are so honored to have Catherine and Dan with us in the audience today, and I'd like them to stand and let us recognize you at this time. We are pleased today to have as our distinguished speaker the Honorable Christopher Wray, the Director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, and we appreciate the critical leadership he is providing for our country at this time. We are so thankful that he has traveled to Athens to be with us today, and we are delighted to welcome him home to Georgia. So now it is my pleasure to introduce Dean Matt Auer of the UGA School of Public and International Affairs, who will provide the formal introduction of Director Wray. Matt?
Well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Matt Auer, and I'm the Dean of the School of Public and International Affairs here at UGA. This year's Getzen Lecture was selected as part of the Provost's signature lecture series highlighting the importance of today's topic, so I want to thank the Provost's office for putting a gold star next to this event. Before introducing our speaker, I'd like to recognize a few people who've joined us today. First, I want to thank our SPIA student ambassadors who welcomed many of you into the chapel, and also to our Masters of Public Administration students and our criminal justice students who are in the audience. And there are also many members of the SPIA faculty and staff who are here. And I am especially grateful to Brad Wright, who's the head of our Department of Public Administration and Policy, for his work in coordinating today's event, and also folks on our own event side here at the School of Public and International Affairs who are backstage. I also wanted to echo the President's thanks to the individuals who make this event possible every year. Catherine Getzen Willoughby, who's an alumna of our PhD program in Public Administration and Policy, and she's a professor here in the department, and Dan Hall Willoughby, who is a graduate of Georgia School of Law and also a former colleague of our guest today. This lecture, as the President said, honors Evangeline and Forrest, the parents of Catherine Willoughby, and they were lifelong advocates of public service and education. So thank you again to the Willoughbys. Let me now introduce this year's Getzen lecturer. Christopher Wray became the 8th director of the FBI on August the 2nd, 2017. Mr. Wray began his law enforcement career in 1997, serving in the Department of Justice as an assistant U.S. attorney for the Northern District of Georgia. In that role, he prosecuted a wide variety of federal criminal cases, including public corruption, gun trafficking, drug offenses, and financial fraud. Beginning in 2001, he had several executive appointments in the Office of the Deputy Attorney General in Washington, D.C. His duties there span the full Department of Justice, DOJ, including responsibility for sensitive investigations conducted by the DOJ's law enforcement agencies. Mr. Wray was nominated by President George W. Bush in 2003 to be Assistant Attorney General for the DOJ's Criminal Division, supervising major national and international criminal investigations and prosecutions. He also oversaw the counterterrorism section and the counterintelligence and export control section within the DOJ's Criminal Division. Mr. Wray was a member of the President's Corporate Fraud Task Force, supervised the Enron Task Force, and served as a leader in DOJ's post-9/11 efforts to combat terrorism, espionage, and cybercrime with domestic and foreign government partners. At the conclusion of his tenure, Mr. Wray was awarded the Edmund J. Randolph Award, DOJ's highest award for leadership and public service. Mr. Wray was born in New York City. He graduated with a bachelor's degree from Yale and earned a law degree from the Yale Law School. He clerked for Judge J. Michael Ludig of the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Fourth Circuit. In 1993, Mr. Wray joined the international law firm of King & Spalding, where he spent a total of almost 17 years practicing law in the area of government investigations and white-collar crime. At the time of his nomination to be director, Mr. Wray was chair of King & Spalding's Special Matters and Government Investigations Practice Group. Please join me in welcoming Christopher Wray as the 2024 Getzen Lecturer.
Thanks. Thank you. Thank you. Well, thanks, Dean, and good afternoon, everybody. I want to begin by thanking you for the opportunity to be back here in Georgia today. This is, as you heard, where my career in law and a few years later, law enforcement really began, and I still consider it home, and so it's great to be back in Bulldog Nation today. I'm also honored to be part of the university's signature lecture series. I'm told that last week's signature lecture featured a Nobel Prize winner, and that you'll hear from another one next week. Now, my wife and kids would tell you that I am most assuredly not a Nobel laureate, but I appreciate your faith that today's talk might be worth listening to anyways. Most of all, I want to add my thanks to Sissy and Dan Willoughby. Since they established the Getzen Lecture Series back in 2006, it's drawn the public's attention to some of the most important ways our nation holds those in power responsible. As you heard, they established the Getzen Lecture in honor of Sissy's parents, Evangeline and Forrest Getzen, both lifelong advocates of public service and education, and today, I understand, marks the first Getzen lecture since Evangeline passed away in January. She was a career civil servant who devoted more than 2 decades to serving others, ultimately as director of North Carolina's Women, Infants, and Children program, and I can't think of a better way to honor her legacy than with the important discussions this lecture series generates. Before I go any further, I want to pause for a moment to touch on something that I know has been on everybody's minds, really all over the country, but especially here, and that's the shocking murder of Laken Riley on campus last month. I want to tell you how heartbroken I am, not just for the family, the friends, classmates, and staff who are grieving Laken's loss, but for Augusta University and the entire UGA community, which many members of my own family are a part of. There's a whole lot of people, students, alumni, and community members alike, who see Athens as kind of a safe haven from what ails so much of the rest of the country. And I'm saddened to see that sense of peace shattered by Laken's murder and the subsequent arrest of a Venezuelan national who'd illegally entered the country in 2022. And please know that the men and women of the FBI's resident agency office here in Athens, our field office in Atlanta, and our offices across the country
stand with you, and we're doing everything we can to help our partners achieve justice for Laken and to tackle the violent crime that continues to plague too many communities. Our mission at the FBI is a broad one: to protect the American people and uphold the Constitution. It covers everything from cyber to counterintelligence to counterterrorism to working with our partners to tackle violent crime, and particularly relevant this afternoon, it includes protecting the vulnerable and holding the powerful accountable. And that's what I want to focus on during my remarks today: the FBI's efforts to ensure that those among us who wield the most power do so by the book, that they follow the same laws as everybody else. Because at the end of the day, that's what the rule of law is all about. Thomas Paine put it in simple terms around the time of our nation's founding when he wrote, "In America, the law is king." It's what distinguishes us from authoritarian regimes like China and Russia, where the rule of law is subordinated to their leaders' despotic will. In our country, it doesn't matter if you're rich or poor, powerful or powerless, a public official or an ordinary citizen. The same rules apply to everyone. It sounds pretty simple. No one is above the law. But to maintain faith in the system, it's up to us to show the American people that those in power, when they break the law, will do our best to hold them accountable too. When the powerful abuse their position, it doesn't just cost taxpayer dollars, disrupt the administration of justice, and cause harm to victims. When those in whom society places so much trust violate their commitment to the people they serve, it undermines faith in our government and public institutions. And that is not just costly and devastating to victims, it's downright dangerous for the rule of law itself. Which is why our work to hold those who abuse power accountable is so core to our mission at the FBI. It includes holding law enforcement accountable when they stray from their oath and abuse their power, harming the very citizens they're sworn to protect. And it includes accountability for public officials who make important decisions about how we're governed and how our hard-earned tax dollars are spent. The FBI's longstanding work pursuing abuses of power is righteous and noble, but it also comes with a healthy dose of scrutiny and second-guessing, and I'll talk more about that in a moment too. But let me start with our efforts to protect American civil rights by holding law enforcement officers accountable. As part of their vital role in enforcing our laws and keeping us all safe, law enforcement officers have the power to arrest and detain, to search and seize property, and in some cases, to even use deadly force. And given all that tremendous power, it's our job to step in and investigate allegations of abuse. Now, I want to be clear here. I have the privilege of being the leader of the world's premier law enforcement agency, and I've spent most of my career proudly working shoulder to shoulder with law enforcement officers. At the FBI, we couldn't have the impact we do without the partnership of the nearly 6,000 state and local law enforcement officers who work alongside our agents on all of our various FBI-led task forces. Last year alone, for instance, the FBI and our law enforcement partners arrested about 18,000 violent criminals and child predators. That's almost 50 bad guys we took off the streets per day, every day, together. So I've been lucky enough to see firsthand what those officers are made of and what they do to make our communities safer. The overwhelming majority of officers are in the job because they think of others before themselves, no matter the cost. They're men and women of courage and character, of dedication and service. They run towards danger, not away from it. They work long hours, longer than most people will ever know, and don't get paid nearly enough for what they do. And much of their work goes on behind the scenes and rarely gets the attention or credit it deserves. To answer the call to go into law enforcement, you got to really want to help people. Because every day, when officers pick up their badges and say goodbye to their families, they know that there's a chance they might not make it home that night. So I'd ask everybody to just stop for a second and think about what that really means. What it takes to be willing to put your life on the line for another human being. And I'm not talking about a member of your family either. I'm talking about a total stranger. And then think about what it takes to do that every single day for an entire career. Not just while you're on the job, but when you're out with your own family too. So it takes a pretty extraordinary person to choose that life, which is why when officers violate their oath and hurt the ones they're sworn to serve instead of protecting them, it's a discredit to those scores of brave men and women who do the job the right way each and every day. And it's why law enforcement at all levels share an interest in holding those who stray accountable. At the FBI, we fulfill that duty as part of our responsibility to safeguard the civil rights of all Americans. And I can think of no better place to discuss that work than here in Georgia, where the Capitol is known as the cradle of the modern civil rights movement. Today, the FBI is the primary federal agency charged with investigating civil rights violations. And while our work combating hate crimes might be what most people think of when it comes to the Bureau's civil rights program, another absolutely essential part of it is our investigation of color of law violations. Those crimes occur when an individual acting under the authority of federal, state, or local laws under what's known as color of law willfully deprives someone of their constitutional rights. And that deprivation of rights can run the gamut from excessive force, false arrest, or obstruction of justice, to sexual assault, withholding medical care, or the failure to keep an individual from harm. And while color of law violations can be committed by anybody acting under their lawful authority, including probation and corrections officers, public officials, prosecutors, and judges, too often they involve law enforcement officers. An investigation the FBI's Jackson, Mississippi field office conducted last year represents a particularly heinous example. So in January of last year, 6 white law enforcement officers committed some absolutely unspeakable crimes. Without a warrant or any exigent circumstances, the 6 of them kicked in the door of a home where 2 black men were staying and subjected them to an hour and a half of hell. Despite having no probable cause to believe either had committed a crime, these 6 officers handcuffed and arrested the men, kicked and beat them, bombarded them with racial slurs, forced them to strip naked, assaulted them with a variety of objects, tased them, not once, not twice, but 17 times, and fired their guns to intimidate them. But that wasn't enough for these guys. One of them had the idea to stage a mock execution. So he took his weapon and secretly removed a bullet from the chamber, and then he put the barrel into one victim's mouth and pulled the trigger, dry firing the gun. And then he did it again, but this time the gun didn't dry fire. It discharged, sending a bullet into the victim's mouth, lacerating his tongue and breaking his jaw. Can you imagine the abject terror those 2 victims must have felt? I mean, who do you call when the police are the ones terrorizing you? No human being should ever be subjected to the torture, the trauma, the horrific acts of violence carried out by these individuals. And as their gunshot victim lay bleeding on the floor, what do you think these 6 law enforcement officers, men who had sworn an oath to protect and serve, did next? Well, I can tell you one thing they didn't do is render aid. Instead, they came up with a cover story and then took steps to corroborate it. They planted a gun on one of the victims, destroyed surveillance video, spent shell casings and taser cartridges, submitted phony drug evidence to the crime lab, filed false reports, charged one of the victims with crimes he had not committed, made false statements to investigators, and pressured witnesses to stick to their cover story. All of that came out in the course of the FBI's investigation. We also found that in addition to those offenses, 3 of the officers had committed other color of law violations just a month earlier, when one of them beat another man, tased him, and fired a gun near his head, attempting to coerce a confession, while the other 2 failed to intervene. Now, I recognize that what happened in Mississippi is an extreme example. In fact, it's hard to imagine a more atrocious set of civil rights violations than those carried out by these guys. But on the flip side, it's hard to imagine more important work than investigating those crimes and seeking justice for the victims. As the result of the Bureau's Color of Law investigation, which we worked in collaboration with our federal and state partners, all 6 pled guilty last August and are being sentenced this week. The contrast between the vast majority of law enforcement officers who are in the job for the right reasons to help people and keep communities safe, and the others, like those 6 in Mississippi, who instead use their power and authority to hurt the most vulnerable. That contrast is what makes color of law violations so immensely harmful. We've entrusted law enforcement officers with vast power and authority, and when they abuse it, when they operate as though they're above the law, they're not just depriving victims of their civil rights, they're degrading the public's trust in our criminal justice system, one violation at a time. And that's why the FBI's work investigating these kinds of abuses is among our most important responsibilities. The philosopher David Hume wrote that the corruption of the best things produces the worst. And I know firsthand the men and women who choose a career of protecting others to be some of the very best among us. But while officers turned criminals make up a tiny fraction of the law enforcement community, the harm they do has the worst possible effect. Because no matter how infrequent, when officers violate the civil rights of ordinary citizens, it erodes trust, often in our most vulnerable communities, making the job that much harder for all those honest men and women who do things the right way. By the same token, public officials, whether they're elected, appointed, or otherwise hired, who use their positions to enrich themselves, also have a corrosive effect on people's faith in government. Now, you've probably heard the maxim, power tends to corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. That was written more than a century ago by Lord Acton, a British historian. But you might not have heard what he wrote a few lines later. Quote, "There is no worse heresy than that the office sanctifies the holder of it." When somebody decides the office they hold places them above the law, it's often the Bureau's job to make sure they're held accountable. Now again, many public servants working at all levels of government are honest and dedicated people who strive to do the right thing for their constituents and their country. Unfortunately, there are also public officials who are only concerned with serving a very specific constituency, themselves. That type of corruption strikes at the very heart of government. It eats away at public confidence and undermines the strength of our democracy. And public corruption is not limited to crooked politicians who get caught with their hands in the till. It can affect everything from how well our borders are secured and our neighborhoods are protected, to how verdicts are handed down in courtrooms and how roads and schools are built. And it can take a significant toll on the public's wallet by siphoning off tax dollars. In fact, estimates put the cost of public corruption to the US government and the American public at billions, that's with a B, billions of dollars every year. That's why the FBI has long made investigating public corruption a top criminal priority. Crimes involving public corruption are often the result of secret deals sealed with whispered handshakes and quick conversations and money paid under the table. Their secretive nature makes them difficult to detect and even more difficult to prove. Fortunately, the Bureau has been working these kinds of crimes for a very long time now, and we've gotten pretty good at it. On any given day, we're working about 3,500 public corruption investigations with our federal, state, and local partners across the country, and our efforts pay off. Over the past 5 years, we've disrupted nearly 2,000 criminal schemes and helped secure more than 3,000 convictions in this arena. Among those criminals we helped convict was a guy named Larry Householder. Now, you might not have heard of him here in Georgia, but I can assure you the folks in Ohio sure have. He was Speaker of the Ohio House of Representatives, where he headed up the most elaborate and extensive corruption scandal that state has ever seen. The scheme centered on House Bill 6, which was under consideration by the Ohio legislature. The bill included a $1 billion bailout for 2 failing nuclear power plants owned by First Energy, one of the nation's largest investor-owned electric systems. And beginning in March of 2017, First Energy started making sizable quarterly payments to householders' tax-exempt social welfare organization, Generation Now, which he and his team used to support the bill's passage and to defeat a subsequent ballot initiative to overturn the law. And in exchange, millions of dollars went to householders' bid for Speaker, to other State House candidates likely to support him, and to line his and his team's own pockets. Householders spent more than $500,000 to pay off his credit cards, repair his home in Florida, and settle a business lawsuit. All in all, the FBI's investigation found First Energy paid upwards of $61 million in bribes to bail out their plants and to put and keep in office politicians like Householder who'd be loyal to the company over their constituents. Now, what he and his co-conspirators did not realize is that the Bureau had someone on the inside. And that insider cooperated with our agents, recorded incriminating phone calls and conversations, and shared text messages sent by members of the conspiracy. I'm pleased to report a jury found Householder guilty of serious racketeering charges, and I'm even more pleased to report that last summer he received the maximum sentence for his crimes, 20 years in federal prison. And when announcing his sentence, the judge called Householder, and I'm quoting the judge here, a bully with a lust for power, and rightly observed that his crimes were, and again I'm quoting the judge, an assault on democracy and a betrayal of everyone in Ohio. The scope of Householder's conspiracy was unprecedented, as was the damage left in his wake in terms of financial harm to the citizens that he'd taken an oath to represent, and erosion of the Ohio public's confidence in their elected officials. And as for the company, First Energy, they signed a deferred prosecution settlement and agreed to pay a $230 million penalty for conspiring to bribe elected officials and others. The amount of time, talent, and resources the FBI and our partners put into that investigation shows how committed we are to pursuing corrupt officials who abuse their offices. And that's just one case. At any given time, we've got hundreds of significant public corruption investigations all over the country. I remember back in my days as a line prosecutor working with phenomenal agents here in Georgia. Whether it was investigating a corrupt sheriff or city official, public corruption cases were among my most challenging and most meaningful. And now in this job, I travel all over the world and meet with my law enforcement counterparts from countries big and small, and I can tell you that the United States' commitment to pursuing well-resourced, highly professional, independent investigations of our community's most powerful members when they break the law is unmatched anywhere. It's one of the things that sets us apart, the level of our commitment to checks and balances and the rule of law. Now that said, often, when following the facts means investigating some of our community's most powerful members, whether that's mayors, judges, sheriffs, or others, the bullseye can end up on our backs as well. In our line of work, almost by definition, there's no way we're going to make everybody happy, whether it's the arrest we made or the one we didn't make. In almost every situation, somebody ain't happy. But unfortunately, in today's world, all too often, people who are unhappy with the outcome start questioning the legitimacy of the institutions themselves. And whether it's a trial, a Supreme Court case, or even an election, people's standard these days for judging whether something was fair or objective is whether they like the result, whether their side won or lost. That's not how independence and objectivity work. That's bad enough when folks denounce a specific case or investigation as tainted or unfair because their side lost. But it gets exponentially worse when that attack goes from this case or that one to saying the whole institution is corrupt because they didn't like a particular outcome. Baseless attacks like that on the very legitimacy of the institutions that make up our democracy are particularly pernicious and strike at the heart of the rule of law. And frankly, against that backdrop, it's especially important to be able to show that we did the right thing in the right way to avoid even the perception of bias in everything we do. Because when the second guessing and armchair quarterbacking inevitably start, the way we defend our work is by showing that we dotted every I, crossed every T, did things by the book, holding ourselves to the highest standards. The FBI is entrusted with an awful lot of authority and power, both of which we need to effectively carry out our mission. Without them, we wouldn't be able to pursue justice in the case of those 6 officers in Mississippi, or to send a corrupt politician to jail for spearheading a multi-million-dollar racketeering conspiracy. But to quote another noted authority, maybe not a lofty figure like Payne, Hume, or Lord Acton, but maybe somebody more my speed, Uncle Ben from Marvel Comics' Spider-Man is credited with saying that with great power comes great responsibility. So while that authority and power are necessary for the FBI to do our job, they also come with an enormous amount of responsibility and, in turn, close scrutiny. And that is how it should be. The work of the FBI is subject to a wide range of internal and external controls, with the aim of holding our organization accountable for what we do. Within the Bureau itself, of course, we've got an internal affairs section in our inspection division, as well as an Office of Professional Responsibility, our disciplinary arm. There's another Office of Professional Responsibility within the Department of Justice, not to mention DOJ's Office of the Inspector General. In addition, there are the whistleblower protections afforded to all FBI employees. There's judicial review of our investigative steps, and then there's Congress and the good folks there who oversee our work. All of those components are in place to make sure people have avenues for reporting violations of the law, dangers to public health and safety, and gross waste, fraud, and abuse. And so those issues can be investigated and corrected. That examination, that oversight, makes us stronger as an organization, and it makes the public safer as a result. For the FBI to be the world's leading law enforcement agency, and for the American public to continue placing their trust in us as an organization, people need to know that we're committed to doing the right thing in the right way. That message is something I've spoken about repeatedly. Some of our folks might say exhaustively, since my very first days as director. It is essential that we follow our processes rigorously every time. That means protecting the American people without fear or favor. It means upholding the Constitution and the rule of law. It means following the facts wherever they lead, no matter who likes it. And trust me, there's always somebody who doesn't like it. Process is what enables us to say, hey, you may not like the result we reach, but you can't credibly say we didn't do things by the book. And it's what allows us and allows people to trust us in the long run, and the people we do the work for and the people we do the work with. Now, unfortunately, there have been times in the FBI's history when we weren't doing the right thing, and certainly weren't doing it in the right way. We're over 115 years old, and any institution that's been around as long as the FBI has is going to make mistakes. What's important is that we learn from them. Now, I'm thinking in particular about the FBI's interactions with Martin Luther King Jr. during a time when we strayed from our core values. In October 1963, Director J. Edgar Hoover and Attorney General Robert Kennedy signed a request to wiretap Dr. King. The FBI's wiretap application was just 5 sentences long and did not present a shred of evidence. The request simply said there was, and I'm quoting here, a communist influence in the racial situation. Our agency went on to wiretap Dr. King's hotel rooms and later sent a reel of tape to his offices in Atlanta. And after listening to it, he said of the FBI, they're out to break me. Dr. King's words about the Bureau are painful to hear. But I don't think any organization can aspire to have an unbiased loyalty to process and truth if it's not willing to turn the spotlight around and look at itself. And so that is something that we work hard to do. There's another familiar Dr. King quote that I think fits us well. The time is always right to do right. And when the FBI falls short of the mark, we are committed to holding ourselves accountable. That's what the American people expect. It's what they deserve. Our mission requires that we remain steadfast in preserving the constitutional rights of all citizens while protecting the safety of our communities. And we know that one need not and must not come at the expense of the other. To reinforce the importance of this critical aspect of our mission, the curriculum for all our new agents and analysts includes those difficult historical lessons and how they relate to our core values: respect, compassion, fairness, integrity, accountability, leadership, diversity, and rigorous obedience to the Constitution. Looking back on that dark chapter in our history reminds us of what can happen when we become untethered from the rule of law and from oversight and accountability for our actions. And I'm proud to be part of an organization that does not hide from its history, but learns from it instead. It would be hard to overstate how essential the FBI's role is in ensuring government accountability, and how important it is to the rule of law that we continue protecting the vulnerable by holding the powerful responsible for their actions. And while there will always be people out there looking to exploit their positions of public trust by serving themselves rather than the American people, with an agency like the FBI on the job, and with institutions like UGA shining a light on why government accountability is so important in the first place, I like our chances. Thank you.
Thank you. That's fabulous.
Yeah, great.
Please. Do you have some time for a few questions?
Absolutely.
So our process was to ask folks who RSVP to send in questions. This lecture, as you know, the Getzen lecture covers accountability, and you just nailed it. Some of the questions that I have for you don't necessarily deal with accountability. Is that okay?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
I answer a lot of questions.
Okay,
in this job,
perfect.
yeah.
So, you know, our school is a School of Public and International Affairs with political science in our school. So I'm going to ask you a politics question. We have a number of folks who are curious about how politics has changed the role of the director. What are some of the things that you grapple with in the realm of politics that maybe wasn't the case 10 or so years ago, and that's in the same role for the director?
Well, I think the first thing I would say when you sort of compare it to history is that anybody who's a student of the FBI knows that, you know, navigating the FBI, which has always had the same mission through a political environment, is not something that's new to this era. And Director Hoover had plenty of his own experiences, as did everybody since then. What is different, of course, is today's social media environment, the polarization that exists in our country that we all talk about. I guess I would say a couple things, because it's a complicated topic. But for one, when it comes to allegations the FBI is politicized, if you look closely or listen carefully, you will notice that far more often than not, the most shrill and breathless accusations of politicization are coming from the most politicized speakers. And I can tell you, it sort of ties back to what I was saying in my speech. You know, if your standard for whether or not something's politicized or not is whether it yielded the result you wanted, we're in a heck of a mess. All I can do is tell you that nobody gets to see the FBI the way I get to see the FBI. In my time as director, I've visited all 56 of our field offices, each of them at least twice. I'm on the third round now. And I've met with all of our employees. I've looked way under the hood. I talk to chiefs and sheriffs who work with us all year long. I talk to judges who hear our agents in court. I talk to business leaders we help with, with cybercrime and Chinese economic espionage. I talk to victims and their families who we help protect from gangs and child predators. And I can tell you, the FBI I see is the same FBI they tell me about, which is 38,000 career law enforcement professionals who are dedicated to serving others and who are respected, admired, and trusted. And I will stack my assessment up against any of those. Now, how do we keep it that way? How do we keep it that way? There's a number of things. One is I've tried to put in place a leadership team that reflects, I think, the best of the Bureau. They're people who've got, over 120, my top group of 8 people reflect, I think 120, maybe even 130 years of FBI experience, served in 20 different field offices, 3 different services within the military before they joined the FBI, et cetera. So we got that. I've put in place all sorts of changes to training, policies and procedures, different safeguards, approvals, oversight requirements. I've added resources to things like compliance and internal affairs, as you heard about. I created a whole new Office of Internal Audit to try to help ensure that level of rigor. And then when it comes to individual accountability, using the tools that are at our disposal, we've used them when that's appropriate and when the process so provides. But ultimately, it kind of boils down to the tone that I described at the beginning, which is the right thing in the right way. And I add that second part because what I've discovered is that there are too many people who, I think, whose view is just, well, as long as I did the right thing, that's all that matters. But if you think carefully about that, that can pretty quickly become, if my heart was in the right place, I can justify my actions. And that pretty quickly becomes finger to the wind. And that pretty quickly becomes the ends justify the means. And if there's one thing an organization as powerful as the FBI can never be, it's an organization where the ends justify the means. So the way I try to explain it to our folks is we've got to be an organization where our means, the process, justifies the end.
Appreciate that. Speaker Johnson recently said that cutting the FBI's budget in FY25 is a major priority of the Republican conference, or the caucus. Wondered what thoughts you have on how that might affect the agency's mission.
Well, look, like a lot of agencies across the federal government right now, there's a lot of talk about budget cuts. We did experience, for the first time in fiscal year 24, some pretty significant cuts. My focus right now is on trying to reason with Congress to try to make sure that they don't make the mistake of doubling down on those in fiscal year 25. You know, when you look at the breadth of the FBI's mission and the impact that we have and the degree to which people rely on us, I think people really ought to think carefully about cuts. I mean, to make that a little more concrete, it's not just the impact that cuts would have on our 38,000 career law enforcement professionals. You know, again, I want to be clear, this ties back to your first question. People talk about politicization. There is not a single political appointee in the Bureau. Every single one of them are career civil servants, career law enforcement professionals. But putting that aside, the impact on them and their families, state and local law enforcement is who gets hurt because they depend on us every day to help fight gangs, to help take fentanyl off the streets, to help go after child predators. I go on and on and on. So ultimately, these cuts, if you want to know who it hurts the American people. The American people that we're helping fight off gangs, child predators, the cartels, terrorists, both foreign and domestic, Chinese spies, hackers. And who does a budget cut help? Gangs, cartels, terrorists, Chinese spies, hackers. So I'm hopeful that cooler heads will prevail in the long run, because regardless of what they think about their short-term objectives, what really matters is the American people that we're all, we and they, sworn to protect.
Big issue for the country, border security, big political issue. In the absence of a bipartisan deal dealing with the border and with immigration in that situation, is there a stepped-up role that the FBI can play?
Well, we play a significant role. I want to be a little bit careful to stay in my lane. After all, the Bureau is not, we got a lot of things that we're entrusted with. The physical security of the border is not one of them. Having said that, we are responsible for and spend an enormous amount of time contending with a whole array of threats that come from across the border. You know, obviously fentanyl is top of mind there. Just to put that in context, it is not unusual for me as FBI director to get briefed on a single FBI field office making a single seizure of fentanyl that's enough fentanyl to kill an entire state. I mean, put that differently, in 2022 and 23, the FBI seized enough fentanyl to kill 270 million American people. That's way more than half the population of the United States. And that's just fentanyl. It's, you know, it's meth. I mean, heck, we had a case in Paulding County, not that far from here, where huge truckloads of meth were coming up from that part of the country. And the violence that I referred to just briefly in my remarks, so much of the violence, especially the gang violence in our country, is tied to the fentanyl problem, because we're finding that in all of our gang takedowns, it's more common than not that we're making big fentanyl seizures as part of that. So the fentanyl problem is also fueling the violent crime problem that's in our country. And that's before you even get to some of the national security concerns that I have about the possibility that terrorists would seek to exploit any vulnerability in our borders. We just had a case not that long ago where there was a guy who was trying to smuggle foreign nationals into the United States in a plot to try to assassinate former President Bush. So we are heavily engaged. We've got, I think, something like 300, maybe almost 400 investigations that are just into cartel leadership. We've got Safe Streets task forces all over the United States going after those gangs I was talking about. We've got joint terrorism task forces all over the U.S. going after terrorist subjects. So we're trying to lean in every way we know how, but make no mistake, it is a serious concern.
Shift real quickly to elections. There have been real concerns about the prospects of foreign interference in both the primaries and now looking ahead to the general election. How does the FBI sort of think about that moving forward?
So I think in terms of what we would expect to see, I think you can expect to see more foreign adversaries getting into the foreign malign influence or election interference, or at least attempted interference game. So more adversaries, newer technology, all of which makes it, you know, that much more challenging. Now, on the flip side, the partnerships that exist between the FBI and our counterparts, between the federal government and secretaries of state and election officials, which is, after all, in our country where elections are actually run, those kinds of partnerships are better than they've ever been. So more adversaries in technology, but better partnerships to defend. So that's part of what we're contending with. Certainly AI is a concern. It lowers the barrier to entry for foreign adversaries to engage in more deceptive campaigns and so forth. So part of our job when it comes to foreign malign influence is to try to expose the hidden hand of a foreign, typically a foreign intelligence service or somebody working at the behest of a foreign intelligence service. So that's kind of on the foreign malign influence side. We also work with both election entities to try to help protect.
I can give you mine. Mine went out too, maybe. Or that might still work.
Yeah, exactly.
Mine works.
Something's happening there, but so we work with state election officials to try to help protect their infrastructure from cyber targets. Is that any better? Woo. Clean up on all 9. So we work with state election officials to try to help protect their infrastructure from cyber attacks, and same thing with campaigns. We also obviously investigate things like voter fraud, voter suppression, and over the last few years, there's a whole other dimension to this. We are investigating when there's violence or threats of violence against election workers. So there's a bunch of ways in which we can contribute, but we don't do it alone. We work with a whole lot of other players in this arena.
Well, the timing is perhaps okay for our communications to be sort of breaking down a little bit here, because we have you on a tight leash. We have other things we're asking you to do during your visit. But I'm remembering your remarks here, protecting the American people and upholding the Constitution. It's very clear it's a genuine part of your personality and your style of leadership at the agency. and it makes an impact on us. So I want to thank you very much for joining us this afternoon. Thank you.